All right, we just needed to give that one more minute. So it was starting time, and we'd like to welcome everybody to today's Wellness Wednesday with Orient. My name is Anne, and I am the webinar moderator. And we have a great presentation today. I'm really looking forward to it it's called Overcoming Anxiety. And we have Jenny Howe here with us to present, and we're really honored to have her with us. I'm going to introduce her in just 1 minute, but before I do that, I just want to get the housekeeping out of the way so we can jump right in. First of all, this presentation and a copy of the slides will be available for everyone for download or whatnot after the presentation through your account at myorient.com. Also, your health promotion points that you receive for participating will also be applied to your account today. And then finally, of course, the questions and chat feature that are in front of you, feel free to participate with us and ask any questions or comments throughout the presentation. If you want more information following the presentation, there's going to be Jenny's website will be available for everyone if you want to reach out to her or work with Jenny and reach out to her. That way we have her information for you all too, because I know you guys will love her today. So with all that said, just really quick, Jenny is a mental and behavioral therapist, and she specializes in anxiety, particularly in children and adolescents. And Jenny, I want you to tell a little bit more about this in a second, but last year, Jenny, narrated and consulted on a documentary called Angst. And I went and saw this, Jenny, with you and heard you present, and Jenny traveled all around the United States sharing this message and her passion about helping people overcome anxiety. Do you want to tell us really quickly about that, Jenny, before we hop in?
Yeah, I was super lucky to be involved in this film. It was a client that I had worked with at a school that specializes in adolescent anxiety and OCD, and she happened to be a film producer. And she's like, man, I just feel like anxiety is so prominent and something that we are all dealing with, and she wanted to make a film about it. And so I was really lucky because I was her son's therapist to be able to be consulted for the film, and I was the consultant behind the scenes and also the main narrator and appeared in the film, which is something that caused me a lot of anxiety, especially having it all over the world now. But we were really lucky to get Michael Phelps, who did the whole thing for free, and his story is shared in it. And it's just a really cool film and a really awesome way to have all populations be able to gain some insight and knowledge into anxiety. So it was awesome.
It really was wonderful, and I was so glad I was able to attend. Is there a way for people to still view this film if they were interested?
Yeah, absolutely. You can go to www.angstmovie.com, angst like teenage angst, and you can request a screening. We just lowered the prices, and May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and so we're offering a lot of deals to try to get this promoted and out in various locations. We've shown it in corporations and schools, in public health forums and hospitals. It's pretty universal in terms of anybody being able to watch it and feel like they gained something from it. So yeah, angstmovie.com.
Oh, wonderful. I thought it was great, and anyone who has, teenagers and adolescents, I think it's great for them to see as well. So
thank you.
Anyway, well, I'm going to get out of the way and let you just jump in. And yeah, we'll just go ahead and let you take over, and I'll help where I can. And I just really appreciate you presenting for us today.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be here. It's a little funny for me because I catch vibes from people, and I'm really wanting to see eyes and eye contact. So I'm hoping you guys are giving me good vibes. I'm feeling it at least through the computer. But we're going to talk about anxiety today. And traditionally when we talk about anxiety, or when culturally we talk about anxiety, we usually talk about things that help us minimize our levels of anxiety. Okay, we're feeling anxious. How do we make that anxiety go away? And I'm going to challenge you to think of anxiety a little differently. I want to go through this presentation. I don't know if we'll get through all of it, but I want to explain some of the biology behind anxiety, why it exists in our life, and then a common profile of somebody who has anxiety or may suffer from perfectionism anxiety or performance anxiety. And then I want to challenge you to kind of look at anxiety a different way. How do we embrace the fear, embrace the anxiety, and our conflict in life, and learn to kind of cope and tolerate it rather than make it go away? Because I believe that when we make our negative emotions, anxiety being one of those, go away, the avoidance of that, it really creates more of it in our life. So it feels counterintuitive, but it actually is what what helps us in the long run. So to tell you, and we can go to the next slide, Anne, I have just as quickly a little bit of my backstory. I'm not just a professional. I went into this career because I grew up in a pretty chaotic world. Those are pictures of me. You can see I was kind of like an angry child. I don't know if that ever left me. But I grew up in inner city San Diego, and most people are like, oh man, San Diego is like the best place in the world. And it was, except for not where I grew up. I grew up, as you can see from the fences and the alleys, in a rougher area of town. I went to 5 different elementary schools. My dad was an alcoholic and drug addict, and he got sober when I turned 8. And so up until the age of 8, my life was a series of unfortunate events. I was the oldest, and I felt like my role in the house was to keep everything perfect and stable. And I began developing what I didn't know at the time, obviously, was a lot of anxiety surrounding perfectionism and control. I really felt like I couldn't control my life, but I could control the outcomes and what I did with my life. So because of that, I really have had a lot of experience and have done a lot of work on myself in the last 40 years and overcoming some of my perfectionistic and anxious tendencies, not necessarily resolve them, but definitely continuing to work on them. So it's something that's really close to my heart based off of my childhood experiences. And the other cool part of that story is when my dad did get sober when I was 8, he really did miraculously turn his life around. And so I was able to witness at a young age a man or a human really change their life, go from the bottom of the barrel to the top. And my parents are still together to this day. He never relapsed, which is miraculous in and out of itself. But I was able to witness just human potential for growth and change. And so that combined with my childhood experiences really just drew me into the field where I know with certainty that people are able to overcome the challenges that they're given, anxiety specifically. Now, I have, next slide, 2 children of my own. I'm a single mom. I have a daughter who's almost 17. So talk about anxiety. My house is run rampant with it. She's a little perfectionist as well. I don't have any idea where she got that from, but she is a straight IB student, 4.0, debate national champion. She's super intense, and we deal with this constantly in our home. And then I also have a little guy who's almost 13, and he has a rare chromosome abnormality called ring 18. So although he doesn't experience much anxiety, certainly being his mom and going through the medical challenges we've faced in his life has been tough. So this theme of anxiety, I share that with you on a personal level because this is something that not only do I know from an academic standpoint, but I live in my life on a daily basis. Next slide. So going into a common anxiety profile, and those of us who are corporate and in the career fields can understand this profile. And I think we probably see this in our homes as well, whether we relate to it or our children do. But usually people with anxiety are intelligent. They have a brain that processes information. And that processing of information, that metacognition, is super helpful in an academic sense. But it also can create a lot of doubts, a lot of questioning, a lot of just constant movement inside the brain. And so that creates anxiety and depression. And oftentimes people with anxiety are lagging executive functioning skills. So organizing and discriminating information, consequence prediction, cognitive flexibility, they're super rigid, they can't be late to anything. Emotional regulation, they feel such intense emotions that it's difficult for them to recover, and delayed gratification. So they lag in social awareness or initiative and assertiveness because of some issues that I'll get into, but they are intelligent. So as you can see, that kind of creates an interesting paradox where you know you should be doing something, but yet you don't necessarily have the skills, or the biology in your brain is not allowing you to do something, which that gap, that incongruence gap, creates quite a discrepancy and leads to issues like self-worth and depression. Next slide. So to talk about anxiety, I want to explain where it comes from. It's the most primal source of emotions inside of our brain. It's called our animal brain, or our reptilian brain, and it's located inside the amygdala. And the amygdala's job, if we were to talk about like caveman time, the amygdala's job was to perceive threat and basically create a situation where we would not die. And so we look around the room, or we look around the forest, I guess if we're talking about caveman time, and we're perceiving if there's a bear that's going to eat us. And as soon as we perceive or hear something, our amygdala fires up, our fight and flight system completely engages, and we save ourselves. That's how we survived. Well, the problem with threat appraisal is that that part of our brain still exists, but obviously we live in a world where we don't have the need to necessarily survive on a physical threat level every single day. But our brain doesn't understand the difference. So how we interpret threat, be it through our social media devices or in a work environment where we feel like somebody's talking behind our back, if we perceive that as threatening and our amygdala gets fired up, it's perceiving that as life or death. So I can't tell you how many times in my career I've been working with a client, and when they describe their anxiety to me, they tell me it feels like death. And it actually really does, because that system in your brain is telling you that you're going to die if you don't do something to get out of that situation. So the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala is where the emotions are, where the fear lives. The prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that's super important. It's the part that organizes all of our information, helps us make really good decisions. Without the executive functioning system or the prefrontal cortex, it's really tough to even go through a checklist or an email or anything like that. So when we feel anxious, the amygdala lights up and we just go straight into survival mode, and it cuts off all neural activity to our prefrontal cortex every single time. So we just respond to survive. And all of these logical things that we're supposed to do in the moment completely can't even be accessed because our frontal lobe is not engaged inside the amygdala. So when we have an impaired threat appraisal, when we have anxiety or generalized anxiety disorder or social anxiety disorder, and we're feeling like things are threatening that aren't necessarily threatening, and I'll give you some examples in a moment, we perceive that threat and we go straight to the amygdala, fight, flight, or freeze. So we either oppose, we get mad, we get angry, we want to fight, we freeze, we just totally stop what we're doing, or we flee, we get the heck out of there. Most of the population that doesn't suffer from an anxiety disorder, they will perceive that threat, and then they will go to their prefrontal cortex and say, I wonder if this is a threat that I should be worried about. And then they will go to their amygdala once they've analyzed the threat. So that's the biggest difference between somebody with an anxiety disorder. They don't have that prefrontal cortex engagement that the population norm does. So on that note, I want to tell you, I think I'll do this after the next slide. So let's go into the next slide. Why does this affect our ability to manage conflict and stress appropriately? Well, you can't adequately access, I'm just going to read this straight from the slide and echo what I said just a moment ago. You can't adequately access the prefrontal cortex when the amygdala is in a constant overpraised state of arousal. Since the prefrontal cortex is responsible for many of our tools used in emotional regulation, without access to it, decisions are often immediate and reactive to the appraised threat level. That activates the sympathetic nervous system, and fight or flight or freeze is engaged. And that's really important to understand. I don't know how many of you, when you felt upset or anxious, have had somebody in your life, somebody you care about, come up to you and like, dude, just chill out. Like, chill out. I want you to just calm down. And you're like, dude, I can't. Like, why would you say that to me? I know I need to calm down. And it's probably the worst thing in the world to hear when you're overwhelmed or stressed or upset about something. That's because this, again, the frontal lobe still exists. It's not like it's not in your brain, but you cannot connect the dots from your emotional brain to that wise brain. So somebody telling you to use that brain just is infuriating because you know you should be using it, but it's not working. You can't access it. And so to think about how we handle those types of escalated episodes inside our home or inside the workplace is a really interesting thing, because if I see one of my kids upset at home, my inclination as a mother is to try to rush in and fix it, to ask them what's wrong, to get them to tell me some answers. Well, if I'm looking at it from a scientific level, that child or that person in that environment is not capable of doing that. They can't give me cause and effect answers. They can't answer a question like, what's wrong? And we immediately rush to trying to fix it and answering and getting them to answer those questions when they're escalated. And that usually just leads to an increase in escalation. So if we approach those conflictual or those high anxiety or stressful moments inside the workplace or home with a different approach, which I'll share with you in a moment, rather than the straight to the frontal lobe approach, tell me what's wrong, how can I fix this? I think we'll have a better outcome. And you'll see that stress will immediately go down and we'll be able to solve the situation. So because this pattern, the one that I just mentioned, the prefrontal cortex not being engaged and the amygdala firing, is repeated so frequently in anxiety, maladaptive and defensive coping strategies are often put into place so that state of arousal can return to homeostasis. I don't know how many of you have had a time in your life when you've been going through a chronically stressful episode, be it a chronic health issue or relationship struggles, or maybe one of your children is struggling, or you're in a work environment that's not ideal for you and you're having to kind of manage on a daily basis. When we're in one of those anxiety-ridden type of modes and life becomes kind of chronically anxious, I think you recognize, at least for me, and what science tells us, our bodies begin to really feel the effects of that. So over time, our stomach starts to hurt, we get muscle tension, we get headaches, and our bodies are responding to this heightened sense of arousal. And there's a lot of medical science, I won't get into it in this presentation, but there's a lot of medical science to substantiate how tightly interwoven our physical health and our mental health specific to anxiety with the increased levels of adrenaline really interplay within one another. So we can't survive for long periods of time with a threat level that's higher than normal. And so because of that, our brains are really awesome at compensating. In this case, not awesome because they're helping us compensate in a way that's not healthy. But we do some things to help rid ourselves of that constant state of arousal when we have an anxiety disorder. So some of the things we do is we avoid. There's no threat if I don't show up. If I'm afraid of what's going to happen when I go to the party and I don't really know anybody, hey, if I just avoid the party, I'm not going to be anxious. Great, problem solved. Another negative coping strategy that we use is ambiguity. There's no threat if I don't act with intention or drive. Well, maybe I'll go to the party, maybe I will. If I show up, I'm not going to really care. Maybe I'll leave early. If you don't pretend like you care about everything, then you can avoid the stress that comes alongside the risk, or at least the emotional risk of attending that party. Opposition. There's no threat if I refuse to comply. I'm not going to go to this party. You can't make me. I'm going to lock myself in my room. You're going to have to pound down the door. Refusal is a lot easier to control than anxiety. So a lot of, especially kids and teenagers that have anxiety disorders, present with opposition or refusal. The last one is over-intellectualism. So there's no threat if I am superior to the threat. There's one more, perfectionism. So if I can over-intellectualize and pretend that I know everything and just justify and rationalize all these reasons why I'm not doing the things that are risky, then there's no threat. And the last, perfectionism. If I can control all of the outcomes, if I can do everything well, then there's no risk and my anxiety level is minimized. So I want you to kind of sit for a minute and think which one of those is your thinking or maladaptive coping strategy of choice. For me, it's definitely, as a teenager, it was definitely opposition. It probably still is at 40. I still have an issue with authority at times. And then also perfectionism. I really liked to control outcomes. So I'm a constant workaholic. I feel like if I put my efforts into work and create the outcomes I want, then I can control all the chaos in my life that's personal. And obviously that's erroneous, but that's something that helps my anxiety level go down in a maladaptive way. Okay, next slide. This one I'm just going to kind of cruise through because it has more technicality in terms of like IQ scores. But as you can see from this, I don't know how familiar you guys are with an IQ test, but there are different components of an IQ test. And basically they go into like comprehension and reasoning and memory skills. And processing speed is one of them. Now, when you have anxiety, oftentimes the profile, an IQ profile that you'll see is high average, if not superior IQ scores. So 146, 151, 135, and then you'll see a processing speed of 85. And that's a huge discrepancy in terms of IQ scores. And there's a couple of different theories as to why, but why that's important is when it shows how smart somebody is generally with anxiety, yet how slowly they're able to access that frontal lobe and process information as a result of their amygdala hijacking everything. So you can imagine how disheartening it must feel to be in a situation where you absolutely, let me give you a classroom example or a work meeting example. You're sitting in a work meeting and let's say you have social anxiety disorder and you're afraid of answering the question because you don't know if people are going to laugh at you or if you're going to sound stupid, if you're going to say words the right way, whatever your particular fear is. And so although you know that you have the right answer and that you could like totally blow everyone away with what you're going to say, your IQ is super high, that processing speed is so slow because you're constantly doubting, well, I don't know if I'm going to say this right. Let me rehearse this in my head a few times. And if I rehearse this a few times, then maybe I can access the information and say it right. And so you're too late. And by the time you get to feeling comfortable enough to be able to answer the question, it's been 5 minutes and everyone has moved on. So you can see how that would really, over time, impact somebody's sense of self-worth and lead to feelings of isolation and avoidance because that processing speed just doesn't match with intellectual ability. And we see that a lot in children and adolescents in school. I can't tell you how many times I've had teenagers refer to me for not turning in their homework or procrastinating on their homework. And what I've discovered is that it's just a little perfectionist who has such high levels of anxiety about the quality of their work that it's easier to not turn in the work at all than it is to turn it in and make a mistake. So oftentimes we're punishing the fact that they're not turning in the work and we're not looking at the reasons why. And it has nothing to do with intellect more often than not. So next slide. Oh, I kind of just went through all of that. So we can skip to the next slide. So what do we do to bridge that gap? What do we do to compensate for those lagging skills? Obviously therapy, there's specific modalities of therapy that are helpful with anxiety disorders, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy being one, and then there are some other components as well. But the biggest, most research-based effective method to treat anxiety is exposure response prevention therapy. And I want to spend just a moment, I don't think I have a slide that talks about this real specifically, but I want to spend just a moment talking about exposure response prevention therapy. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, this is where the counterintuitive nature of what's going to help you heal from anxiety really comes into play. So if I have somebody who's newly referred to me and they're sitting on my couch and I'm trying to teach them what exposure response prevention therapy, or ERP for short, is, I would describe it this way. Let's say that I'm afraid of snakes, which I am, and they actually mentioned in that film I was in. I will do everything I can to avoid snakes. I do not go into the reptile house at the zoo. I do not trail run in the summer, especially in July when the rattlesnakes are out. There are things, when I go to a park and it's hot outside because I grew up around rattlesnakes in San Diego, I'll always check under the park equipment to make sure there are no snakes. So I avoid, I overcheck. I'm constantly in a state of arousal if I feel like snakes are around. So the idea behind exposure therapy is the more you avoid a situation, the more I avoid the reptile house, the more I avoid trail running in the summer, the higher my anxiety level gets. And that's basically the process of negative reinforcement at its finest. So if any of you are familiar with Pavlovian theory or like the whole ring the bell and the dog salivate theory, it's basically based off of that. So when our brain, when that amygdala is fired up and it's like, alert, 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 there may be a snake, and we avoid the situation that a snake could possibly be in, our brain then kind of puts a notch in its belt and it's like, okay, yeah, that was true. That was an accurate threat appraisal. You avoided that situation, and so therefore it must have been real. So every time we avoid it, we are adding fuel to the fire that we should be alerted if there is a snake around. So in order to reverse that cycle, we have to expose ourselves to the thing that we fear. So for me, I would begin by entering the reptile house. Then I would perhaps start trail running once or twice a week in the dead of summer, which sounds miserable. I'd go in the evening so that I didn't have to be so hot. But I would put myself in situations where snakes could be present. And then I would gradually work myself up to above the baseline, which would be holding a snake, petting a snake, being around a snake that's on the loose. Things like that would obviously make me absolutely terrified, but I would be training my brain, that amygdala response cycle, that I can be around a steak, I can tolerate it, and I don't need to activate my sympathetic nervous system. I can tolerate it and I will be okay. What comes up in terms of threat appraisal will always come down. And the only way to retrain our brain is through those experiences, through those outcomes. We can't think it away. We can't even sit in the therapist's office and talk it away. Research shows this over and over and over, especially the last 10 years as we've been able to use functional MRI machines and all of the equipment we have now to actually appropriately study this. We have to experience our exposure to the fear and refrain from avoiding it in order to get over it. So most of my clients, we do a lot of non-office work. I have a client right now who has an actual peanut allergy, but it's developed into such a phobia that she wasn't able to eat at restaurants. She wasn't able to even go inside her pantry for fear that there might be some cross-contamination. And yesterday, after 6 sessions, she was able to put her hands in a bag of nuts and refrain from washing her hands for 2 hours. And of course, she didn't have an allergic reaction. She's a very mild allergy. But she's worked her way up through exposure therapy to be able to understand now that she can be, and she's a cute teenage girl, she can be involved in all these fun things and not have the fear consume her. So there are quite a few slides left. I know we're kind of getting close to running out of time, so I want to see if there's some questions and answers. But if you were to look at the rest of the slides on your own, I will talk a little bit about conflict resolution and the key to having an appropriate response rather than going straight to that frontal lobe response, which we want to do when we want to fix the conflict, allowing somebody to de-escalate first and then engaging in a conversation when it's not a crisis moment. There's going to be some tips and some explanations as to how to do that in the rest of the slides.
Jenny, we do have some questions. I'll just give you 2 really quick.
Great.
So first, along this ERP therapy idea, someone asked, how would you apply that to the fear of heights? Maybe high dive, cliffs? I don't know. What would you say?
Oh, awesome. Yeah, no, I actually have done that to myself, so I have a great answer for it. For somebody who's scared of heights, from a therapeutic level, we'll create something called a fear hierarchy or have somebody get really, really specific and list what they're afraid of. But with height, specifically, I'd have somebody go to the mountains and start hiking and kind of develop a closer stance towards the end of the trail rather than kind of leaning towards the inside of the trail. I've had clients that have been a passenger in a car driving up a mountain road where there may be a cliff on one side. I've had clients go to like a bungee jumping place and bungee jump off of that is one of the final exposures. So incrementally, you want to kind of make sure you're not diving into the deep end of the pool, at least without a therapist, but kind of dipping your toes in the water, letting yourself get warm, and then increasing the exposure.
So going about it slowly, that makes a lot of sense, definitely.
Yeah.
What about, I've had a few more even just come in. So what about strategies for de-escalating yourself when you're in an active high anxiety situation? What if you're like right in the minute of panic or, really in it?
Great question. There's a couple of ways to do this. I could talk about this for 2 hours. So I'll give you a real quick short answer. The first is there are some preventative strategies that are exposure-based to help our body get used to the physical symptoms of arousal that happens with panic. And so that's a preventative strategy you could work on with an ERP-trained therapist. On the other end of the spectrum, the absolute only thing that works when we are in a heightened state of arousal is distraction. So rather than trying to sit in that fear, to think about how you're feeling, to think about how you have that shortness of breath, you have to put yourself in a situation to be distracted. I'm going to give you a really quick story about this. A couple of years ago, I was working at this boarding school, and we had a newly enrolled student who was absolutely terrified. He had just left his parents. He was upset. He was crying on the floor, and we had a lot of new staff who were there trying to get us, hey buddy, what's wrong? Come walk with me, and trying to get him to engage that frontal lobe, which obviously wasn't working because he was in such a heightened state of arousal. So I came up to the situation after this kid had been escalated for like 30 minutes, and I turned to him and said, hey bud, have you ever been to Disneyland? And he stopped crying immediately, and he said, yes, I have. And I said, cool, will you walk with me to the classroom? And he did. And what that did was push his brain into the frontal lobe. It distracted him enough from how he was feeling to be able to say, oh yeah, like I have to access some memories here and think about the last time I was at Disneyland. And that allowed them to reconnect those neural pathways. So when we are in a state of arousal like that, having some things that we do, I used to always get up and go grab a Coke at the gas station when I worked. I'd get up and take a walk around the office. Something to get me out of that place and distract my mind rather than focusing on what's making me anxious.
Jenny, that reminds me of parenting toddlers. We're just kind of big toddlers sometimes, right? You just got to
Everybody's a big toddler.
Right?
Yep.
That is awesome.
We are. The more we recognize that, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have two questions about perfectionism. So one is,
okay.
What do you do when you cannot control the outcome of the threat? And then the other one is, what's the best solution to handle perfectionism? Like, what strategy would you use? And I don't know if you'd give the same answer for both of those. That's why I threw them both at you.
Yeah, I mean, it's multifaceted and obviously individual to the person and how they are kind of enacting their perfectionism. Some people are more prone to do it in outcomes where other people can see it. We call that perceived perfectionism. So they don't necessarily have those high internal standards, but they definitely care if others think that they're perfect. And some people have high internal standards and aren't really paying attention to how other people perceive them. So that's a distinction I make when I'm working with perfectionism. But how you would treat perfectionism is, and of course, I laughed when you said, how do we handle a situation when we can't control the outcome? That's exactly the exposure therapy that I do with my perfectionists. Is I have them turn in assignments that aren't worth a lot of points or something like that, or send an email with an error in it. And we begin making mistakes and showing people that, hey, you know what, I can actually send this email without using spell check, or send this text without using spell check, and the person is still going to be okay with me on the other end. So gradually increasing our exposure to making mistakes. Something that I say over and over, I probably say this daily in the work that I do, is the biggest irony of life is that we only feel capable through failure. Failure is absolutely the only thing that helps us feel capable. And so perfectionists believe that by controlling those outcomes, we feel capable. And usually that's not right. Most of the perfectionists I have that sit in my office have very, very low self-esteem. So they need to fail. We need to create situations for perfectionists to fail and let them know that that's okay. So I know that's counterintuitive, but that's the only thing that works.
I love that. That's fantastic. That makes a lot of sense to me, and I, am not you. So let me ask you really quick. Well, first of all, it is 12:30, so for those who are on a time crunch, I want to invite you to go ahead and hop off, and you can listen to the remainder of this presentation later because it will be available online. But if you've got a minute and want to hang tight, I want to ask you just a couple more questions, Jenny, if that's okay.
Sure, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
So another one that's come in is, how is general anxiety different from maybe anxiety based on like an event, like something scary happened and now you have anxiety about that event, and how do you cope with that? And how is that different from like generalized anxiety?
Great question. So there are quite a few different anxiety disorders in our diagnostic manual. Generalized anxiety disorder is basically that amygdala threat appraisal system is hot-wired all the time. So it's always on alert. Those people live in a constant state of arousal. Somebody who has a more specific fear, so if it's related to past trauma, we would diagnose that as PTSD, which is actually its own category now in our manual. And that would be, and actually the treatment for that is exposure response prevention as well, wrapped around with some other modalities. Or a specific phobia, like somebody is just afraid of peanuts or just afraid of snakes, we would also do exposure therapy. So those usually are onsetted by triggers or specific antecedents. And we can just re-trigger the person in a safe environment and help them understand that their brain doesn't have to be hot-wired to that situation. So generalized anxiety disorder is probably the most life-impeding, just because that arousal system is always heightened. The others are really specific to triggers and antecedents.
Great, great. Now, what if you're anxious about anxiety? Like, you have had a panic attack, and anxiety attack, and then you're anxious about the anxiety itself.
Yeah. Super common. In fact, that's usually the last phase of treatment for the clients that I work with that have anxiety. We call it the anxiety about anxiety loop. So once you've dealt with this chronic threat appraisal or misappraisal, I should say, you don't want to go back to feeling that way. And so you start to kind of like consider, okay, the second my stomach starts churning, or the second I start to get kind of a minor or normal state of arousal, oh no, this could get really, really bad and I could have a panic attack. I actually treat that, you're going to get sick of me saying that, with ERP or exposure response as well. And that is when I'll have somebody in my office intentionally, and then also do some homework assignments at least 2 or 3 times a day. I have a client right now doing this, where they purposefully create those and mimic those symptoms of panic, and then sit in it and tolerate it. So I'll have them breathe through a straw for 2 minutes, or I'll have them put their head in between their knees and create some nausea, or I'll have them spin in a circle, or I'll have them do some super intense sprints for 2 minutes. And I try to get their body used to having those physical symptoms without inducing panic, and tolerating that. And it's super effective. It usually works within just a few weeks, honestly. But that's, kind of that anxiety about having anxiety or panic loop is the final stage of treatment often.
That makes so much sense to me, to create that physical response in a way that is manageable. That's awesome. Yep. Okay, so I have another one, and this one was asked early on, but I've been saving it because I think you might be heading there in a second. But this has to do with, what if it's not you? What if it's your loved one, right? So the question is, my wife is prone to panic attacks and stresses out easily. How do I help her? And like you said, how do we respond besides saying calm down if it's not us that's anxious?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Again, this is a whole nother presentation worth of answers that I'll try to condense here in the next few seconds. But the trap that we fall into when it's a loved one, whether it's a spouse or a partner or a child, is we want them to just feel better. So oftentimes we aid and abet them in doing the worst thing possible, which is avoiding. So let's say your wife gets really stressed out, and I'm just, creating an idea in my head, making phone calls. So your role is to make all the phone calls in the family because you don't want her to get stressed out about it. What you're doing is making that anxiety worse for her, because you're telling her brain, hey, you can't handle this. You're not capable of handling this, so I'll take this off of your plate. So what we need to do is support, listen. Sometimes the best thing is to just sit there with someone as they're having a panic attack, maybe gently prompt them, distract them. I have a couple of questions that I always ask people that are in their anxious spaces, like, hey, did you see American Idol this week? And usually they're like, no, what are you talking about? But the second they do that, I know that they've got their frontal lobe. But the worst thing we do is fix it. Because the more that we fix it, the more that we enable, the less capable they're going to feel, and that's going to lead to, retrograde depression and self-worth issues. So helping gently encourage them. I would encourage them to get some therapy. Oftentimes, a partner or a spouse or a parent isn't a great exposure coach, because obviously they're going to be like, don't tell me what to do. So having somebody else there to kind of prompt them and help them learn that process is going to help them feel capable is necessary, especially if it's a chronic issue. But I'll give you a quick example. My daughter, I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, suffers from anxiety, and she's super intense about it when it happens. And a couple of weeks ago, it was finals week, and she had a grade she didn't like, and one of her teachers was making her angry, and she procrastinated because she's a perfectionist, and she was just freaking out and screaming and yelling and like saying the education system failed her. I don't even know what she was saying. It was out of control. And rather, my inclination, it was very difficult not to, even knowing what I know, was to come in and help her, right? Like, okay, let me see what I can take off of your plate. But I knew I couldn't do that. That wasn't going to help her understand how to emotionally regulate herself. So I just stood at her doorway and I listened to her. I didn't engage. I just said, yeah, it sounds like, you're having a really hard time right now. And she went through and did her ranting and raving, and I just had to stay calm for about 10 minutes. And then when she was starting to slow down, I said, hey, Ab, I'm going to be back in about 5 minutes. And if you're calm, I'd love to help you get organized. But I wasn't going to do that when she was in that state of arousal. And I wasn't going to do her work for her. I was going to support her by helping her get organized, but I wasn't going to remove the thing that was causing her stress. I don't know if that's an example that can help.
That is a fabulous example, and I need you to come help me parent at my house.
I'm sure Abby would willingly pick me up.
I'll be like, can
tell
I
them right
borrow
here in my
you?
home all the time. I wish my mom wasn't a therapist. I wish you weren't a therapist.
Yes,
So,
yes. My kids say that about me being a health coach, so I kind of get that. That's awesome. Well, you are a wealth of knowledge, and I think we could go on and on and on with all sorts of questions. And I just really appreciate you being willing to share and answer these questions. It's been so helpful. I don't know if
sure.
there's anything on the remaining slides you want to touch on, or if we should just wrap it up. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it probably, I mean, yeah, I think it would probably take me another 20 or 30 minutes to go through the rest. So we'll
Yeah,
probably
there's
just wrap
lots,
it up. Yeah.
lots of great information. Well, then what I'm going to do really quick, Jenny, is I am just going
Uh-huh.
to quickly advance to the final slide because it has
Okay.
it just
Oh,
has
yes.
your website. So if any of you want to reach out to Jenny, want to see her, or contact her, this is her website, jennyhoweconsulting.com. I hope it's okay, Jenny, that we throw that out there for
Yeah, of
you.
course.
So
Sure.
you can reach out to Jenny as well, and if you want to work with her or have her help any of your loved ones, that is how you would reach Jenny. And again, we like to thank you, Jenny, for presenting for us today. I really appreciate all that you've shared, and we'd like to thank everyone else for joining us today. And you can follow up if you have any questions you want us to follow up with you on. You can leave those as you exit, and otherwise, we'll just sign off for today. Next month, we have Dr. Baban. She is from George Washington University, and she is a doctor in mindfulness, and she is going to be presenting for us next month. So make sure you watch out for
Awesome.
that as well. Yes. So thank you again, Jenny,
Well,
so
thank you
much.
for having me. Yeah, thanks
We
for having
really
me, you guys. Have a
appreciate
good
it.
day.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.